And finally, the last but definitely not the least, we are delighted to have with us tonight Ciara Torres-Spelliscy, who is the Leroy Heibaugh Senior Research Chair and Professor of Law at Stetson University's School of Law. Professor Torres-Spelliscy was counsel in the democracy program of the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law, where she provided guidance on the issues of money in politics and the judiciary to state and federal lawmakers. She is the author of the book Corporate Citizen, an argument for the separation of corporation and state. Come on out, Ciara. And with that, we're ready to begin our debate, which will feature what the National Constitution is so proud of the most, opportunities to disagree without being disagreeable. This is what makes the National Constitution Center unique. We'll turn it over to our moderator for the evening.
Good evening. My name is Ciara Torres-Spelliscy, and I've been tasked with giving you a crash course in campaign finance in 8 minutes. Here we go. All right. So since we're at the National Constitution Center, I thought we should start with the text of the Constitution. The text of the Constitution, as someone who has to teach it to first years, is very frustrating in that it doesn't address a lot of modern problems. And money in politics is one of those modern problems that is not clearly addressed by the text. You can look in vain for the words campaign finance or the words money in politics in the text of the original Constitution, and you will not find it. And against that silence in the text, the Congress and the states have passed a series of campaign finance laws that try to address the issue of money in politics. Now, there are various ways that you can address money in politics through legislation. You can have contribution limits, expenditure limits, disclosure, source bans. You can offer public financing to candidates. So there's also a long and rich tradition of challenging these campaign finance laws. And so when these cases get to the door of the Supreme Court, typically what the Supreme Court does when looking at a campaign finance law is they apply the First Amendment, which very much is in the Constitution. And they look at the law using the First Amendment as a source of analysis. So, and this is a gross oversimplification, but I don't have much time. When the court looks at expenditure limits, they typically look at freedom of speech. When the court is looking at contribution limits, they typically look at it as a freedom of association right. And because they are using the First Amendment, they typically use heightened scrutiny, either intermediate scrutiny or strict scrutiny. Now, I work on the issue of money in politics, and I'm very much on the reform side. And the reason that I'm on the reform side is my intuition that wealth is not a synonym for wisdom. Let me say that again. I am pretty sure that wealth is not a synonym for wisdom. And thus, I think it's reasonable to put in limits on money in politics so that wealth doesn't swamp our democracy. But reasonable minds can and do disagree about campaign finance. And if you come to this issue from the point of view that money is speech, then you'll probably end up closer to where the current Supreme Court has ended up, which is allowing more money into our political system. Now, there are two big cases that have led us to this point. One is Buckley versus Vallejo from the 1970s. Buckley holds that expenditure limits on individuals are unconstitutional. And then more recently, in Citizens United versus FEC, The Supreme Court similarly held that expenditure limits as applied to corporations are similarly unconstitutional. And that puts lawmakers in a bit of a bind if they want to impose certain expenditure limits on either individuals or corporations. If Congress woke up tomorrow and decided we really want to put limits on how much corporations can spend in American elections, they would not be able to do that under this Supreme Court's reading of this Constitution. And thus, the question of whether we should amend the Constitution to allow for such restrictions. And you can see the impact of Buckley and Citizens United in every American election, including the one that we just had. So we just had a midterm election, and it was the most expensive midterm election we have had in our history. So part of how you get to that big grand total is if you look at the Senate candidates and you add it to the House candidates and you look at what all federal candidates spent in 2018, it was $2 billion. And then on top of that, there was a lot of independent spending, outside groups who were not affiliated with either a candidate or a political party. The outside groups spent an additional $1.3 billion. So, for those of us who are concerned about money in politics, one of the things that we work on is the 28th Amendment, which, do we have the text of the Udall Amendment? It'll get there eventually, I assure you. So the Udall Amendment has three basic components. One, it would allow for expenditure limits for individuals, so that would fix the Buckley problem. It would allow for expenditure limits for corporations. That would fix the Citizens United problem. And it also anticipates something that you're probably going to hear about tonight, which is a concern about this approach to amending the Constitution, because it would be one of the first times that the First Amendment itself is being amended. And so the third part allows for preservation of freedom of the press. And we'll get into why that would be necessary and why this may not be enough for those who find amending the Constitution in this way more troubling. So we're going to have some democracy in the hall. We are going to vote on the following question. Should we amend the US Constitution to allow for expenditure limits? So in order to vote, you go to www.menti.com, which is MENTI.com. You use code 357381 again in order to vote, and we're voting on whether we should amend the Constitution to allow for expenditure limits. It's www.menti.com, MENTI.com, 357381. Please vote now, and then we'll also vote at the end of the debate, and we'll see if either side has moved any of you and in which direction. All right, well, I am very pleased to turn this over to our able debaters. We're going to have a speaker for the amendment, then a speaker against the amendment, then a speaker for the amendment, then a speaker against the amendment. And then after that period, we'll have some time for questions. I'll ask a few questions of our debaters, and I'll take a few questions from the audience as well. And then we will get the closing arguments from each of our debaters as well. And then at the very end, we will vote again, and we will see whether you have changed your minds.